Shortly before 6 in the morning on June 4th, 1989, a sailing yacht called the Rose Noelle was floating quietly somewhere off the coast of New Zealand. Below deck, 4 men were asleep. The previous day had been brutal. Fierce winds, heavy seas, a relentless fight to keep the vessel under control. But the sails had been brought in, a sea anchor had been put out to hold the boat steady, and by the time the men finally went below to rest, the worst of the storm seemed to have passed. Through the night, wind gusts had climbed toward hurricane force, at one point exceeding 69 miles per hour or around 111 kilometers per hour. But by the early morning hours, things had quieted enough for all 4 of them to fall asleep. Then just as the clock approached 6 a.m., a deep and growing roar filled the cabin. It wasn't thunder, and it wasn't the wind. It was getting louder. What followed would become one of the longest and most punishing survival ordeals ever recorded at sea. As always, viewer discretion is advised. The sound the 4 men heard that morning was a rogue wave, one that had built to over 60 feet or roughly 18 meters before bearing down on the Rose Noelle. The men had only seconds to react. They grabbed for whatever they could hold onto as the boat lurched sharply upward. For a brief moment, it felt like the yacht was being suspended in place, tilted almost completely vertical, and then it went over. The wave flipped the Rose Noelle completely upside down. Inside the cabin, everything that wasn't bolted down became a projectile. Gear, supplies, equipment, all of it was thrown in every direction as water poured in from all sides, and within seconds the boat was inverted, floating hull up on the surface of the ocean. The 4 men found themselves in total darkness, disoriented, with the floor above their heads and the ceiling now submerged beneath them. Water had flooded the lower sections of the cabin and was pressing in from every direction. What saved them, at least in that first moment, was a large pocket of trapped air that had formed inside the cabin as the boat turned over. The Rose Noelle hadn't sunk. It was still on the surface, just upside down. That air pocket was the only thing standing between 4 men and drowning. Just a few days earlier, this had been nothing more than a winter holiday. The Rose Noelle was a trimaran, a type of sailing vessel built around a main central hull with 2 smaller outer hulls attached by cross beams on either side. And the design gives these boats a combination of speed and stability that traditional single-hull vessels can't match. They sit lighter in the water, move faster in open conditions, and can handle rough seas better than most other sailboat types. At just over 41 feet, about 12.5 meters, the Rose Noelle wasn't a large yacht by any measure, but it wasn't a fragile one either. John Glennie, who was the captain of the group and one of the 4 men now trapped inside it, had actually built the boat himself. He had years of experience sailing the South Pacific and had used modern materials and construction methods that were considered fairly advanced at the time. He named the boat after a former girlfriend and believed it was capable of handling serious offshore conditions. And the fact that it had been turned upside down by a wave and was still floating rather than broken apart and sinking was a testament to the way it had been built. Trimarans do behave differently from conventional sailboats in bad weather. They're more resistant to rolling under normal conditions, but when they do lose their footing, the transition can be sudden. A wave hitting at the wrong angle, especially when the boat has already been slightly turned sideways, can overwhelm the design very quickly. That's essentially what had happened here. John was 48 years old and the most experienced sailor among the group. He had spent considerable time in the southern seas and understood what long offshore passages demanded. He was steady under pressure, comfortable making hard decisions, and confident in both his skills and the vessel he'd built. Phil Hoffman was 41 and approached life from a different angle. He had less time on the water but made up for it with energy and enthusiasm. His wife Karen described him as someone who didn't just want his glass to be half full, he wanted it overflowing. They had married young, built their lives around family, and by the time of this voyage they had 4 children and were living aboard their own boat as they traveled around New Zealand. Phil had been docked in Picton when the Rose Noelle happened to tie up nearby. A conversation with John led to an invitation, and Phil, a builder by trade, used to physical work and not short on confidence, agreed to come along without much hesitation. He had already had triple bypass heart surgery by that point, and still, on the chance to sail to Tonga, felt like exactly the kind of opportunity he wasn't willing to pass up. Rick Hellegreel and Jim Nalepka came to the voyage in a more straightforward way. Both had responded to an advertisement John had posted at a local backpackers hostel looking for crew members to make the run north. Rick was 31, Jim, an American, was 38. Neither had deep experience with offshore sailing, and neither had any prior connection to John or Phil. They signed on because the timing suited them and the offer seemed worthwhile. When the four of them boarded the Rose Noelle together in Picton on June 1st, 1989, they weren't a close-knit crew. They were, for the most part, strangers, brought together by circumstance and a shared destination that would matter later. The plan was simple. Sail north from New Zealand to Tonga. I'd spend a few weeks enjoying warmer weather, then sail back. The whole trip was expected to take about 3 weeks. For the first day and a half, it went almost exactly as planned. The weather was reasonable, the seas were manageable, and the trimaran covered distance efficiently. John set up watch rotations, the men adjusted the sails and shared meals, and everything moved along without issue. But once they cleared the New Zealand coast, the ocean opened up quickly, shipping traffic thinned out, aircraft became less frequent overhead. The route they were on wasn't one that saw regular boat traffic, particularly in winter. If something went wrong, there was no nearby port and no guarantee that a call for help would reach anyone. By the second half of the second day, conditions began to change, and the wind stiffened out of the north, and the sea state shifted with it, waves growing steeper and less predictable, the ride becoming noticeably harder. It was still within the range of what an experienced skipper would consider manageable, but it required more effort. Then the wind increased further. The seas built in response. Steering the yacht turned into a full physical commitment, demanding constant attention and effort. John took the wheel himself and held it for as long as he could, but eventually it became clear that continuing to push forward wasn't the right call. He made the decision to slow the Rose Noelle down and wait out the storm. A sea anchor was deployed, a device that drags through the water to hold the bow pointed into the oncoming waves. Used correctly, it keeps a vessel from being knocked sideways in rough conditions, reducing the risk to both the boat and the people aboard. Once it was out, the Rose Noelle settled into position, and the motion became more controlled. With things as stable as they were going to get, the men went below, soaked and worn out, and tried to sleep. During the night, the wind dropped, which should have been a welcome development. Instead, without the wind pressing down on the water's surface, the waves grew taller and heavier, and at some point in the darkness, something else happened that no one below deck was aware of. The sea anchor fouled. The rope had twisted or tangled in a way that caused the bow to slowly begin turning away from the waves. The boat started to drift sideways, exposing its full length to the approaching swells, and the movement was subtle enough that none of the men felt it from their bunks. They were still asleep when the roaring started. As the wave passed and the roaring faded, the four men were left in complete darkness, calling out to each other through the chaos. One by one, each of them answered. Remarkably, not one of them had been seriously injured during the capsize. But the relief from that was short-lived. The situation they now found themselves in was immediately clear to all of them. The boat was upside down. Water had flooded most of the interior. The air pocket keeping them alive was shrinking. And outside they were somewhere in the open Pacific Ocean, with no way to immediately signal for help. John understood that staying where they were, partially submerged in cold seawater, would eventually kill them, whether through hypothermia or exhaustion. Moving carefully through the flooded darkness, the four men worked their way to a small rear cabin located beneath the cockpit. It was a tight, cramped space, even under ordinary circumstances, but it held the largest concentration of trapped air in the boat. They pulled in whatever they could find, mattresses, drawers, loose panels, anything that would stack, and built a raised platform to keep themselves out of the water. A mattress placed on top gave them somewhere dry to lie down. It was barely 4.5 feet wide. There was no room to move without everyone else having to shift along with you. They climbed onto it and pressed together for warmth. Once they had a moment to think clearly, the next priority became escape and signaling. Using tools they were able to reach, the men cut a hole through the hull just large enough to crawl through. It was their only connection to the outside world, and it gave them a way out if conditions allowed. John then activated the emergency radio beacon. In his mind, that single action was the turning point. The beacon would transmit their position. Someone would pick up the signal. Rescue would come. He believed the worst was behind them. He was wrong. For 8 days, the Rose Noelle drifted upside down and completely undetected. The capsize had occurred roughly 140 miles off the east coast of New Zealand, near the outer edge of normal shipping routes. It was a part of the Pacific that commercial vessels had little reason to travel through, where fishing boats didn't venture far from shore, and where air traffic overhead was sparse at best. Sailors sometimes referred to stretches of ocean like this as marine deserts, vast, empty, and rarely crossed. The emergency beacon was transmitting, but its signal could only be received within a certain range, and at their position, there were no aircraft flying the right frequencies to pick it up. For 8 days, it broadcast their location into empty sky. Then it stopped working altogether. The beacon had no indicator light, no alarm, nothing to tell the men inside the overturned hull that their primary means of rescue had just gone silent. So they continued to wait, rationing their energy, taking turns looking out through the escape hatch when the weather allowed. As the days accumulated, the mood inside the hull shifted, and the realization arrived gradually and then all at once. If no one had responded by now, no one was coming. Whatever the beacon had been supposed to do, it hadn't worked. Either the signal never reached anyone, or they were simply too far removed from any vessel or aircraft capable of responding. From that point forward, every decision the 4 men made had to be based on a single assumption. They were completely on their own. That change in thinking brought the next problem sharply into focus. They didn't have enough supplies to last. Most of the food and water aboard the Rose Noelle was stored in sections of the cabin that were now submerged. Reaching any of it meant diving into cold, dark water and searching by feel. John took that task on himself, periodically dropping into the flooded interior to retrieve whatever he could find. Yet early on, they survived on emergency rations. Small portions intended to buy time, not sustain 4 people indefinitely. Eventually, John managed to recover some of the stored food. What he brought back wasn't ideal, mostly apples and boxes of breakfast cereal that had absorbed seawater, but it was something, and it helped. He also managed to salvage a small gas cooker and a portable barbecue grill. Both would turn out to be more important than they seemed at the time. Fresh water was a different and more serious problem. The Rose Noelle had been carrying around 140 liters of fresh water in onboard tanks. The men assumed early on that this supply was secure and rationed it carefully, believing they had weeks before it became critical. What they didn't know was that the tanks had been quietly leaking the entire time, and seams or fittings had failed at some point, and the water had been draining away day after day without anyone realizing it. By the time they understood what was happening, a significant portion of their most essential resource was already gone. After that, strict rationing took over. For weeks, their daily fluid intake amounted to little more than a few mouthfuls, supplemented by whatever soft drinks John had managed to recover from the submerged storage areas. Then, on their 40th day at sea, it rained. John had previously put together a basic water collection system using split sections of plastic pipe to catch runoff from the upturned hull. When the rain came, it filled their containers faster than they could have hoped. They had water again. Enough to drink properly, enough to make tea each morning, or enough to stop counting every sip. It wasn't safety, but it was something close to relief. Food and water were only part of what the 4 men had to manage. The rest of it, arguably the harder part, was each other. They had started the voyage as strangers, and now they were confined to a space barely large enough for one person to lie down in comfort. Cold, hungry, exhausted, and with nowhere to go, the friction between them built steadily. Arguments broke out over things that would have seemed absurd in any other context. Who got the better position on the mattress? Who could sit closest to the escape hatch where a little daylight filtered in? Disagreements over half a biscuit turned serious because there was so little to go around, and every small thing carried weight it wouldn't have carried otherwise. At its worst, the tension moved into genuinely dark territory. One of the men, whose name was not included in the accounts because when Mike became a source of serious conflict with the others. The situation deteriorated to the point where, on more than one occasion, the remaining 3 apparently discussed the possibility of killing him and disposing of the body overboard. Nothing ever came of it. But the fact that the thought existed at all and persisted spoke to the psychological pressure that 4 months in that space placed on all of them. During the worst storms, they were sometimes pinned to the mattress together for 4 or 5 consecutive days, unable to move without risking being swept off the hull. Those stretches were the most suffocating, not just physically, but mentally. Slowly, though, something shifted. Whatever friction existed between them, survival forced a kind of interdependence that had nothing to do with friendship. They were bound to each other not by choice, but by necessity. And over time, that shared experience created its own form of connection. Meanwhile, the Rose Noelle itself was transforming. Floating upside down for months, the hull had become a substrate for marine growth. Barnacles and mollusks attached themselves across the fiberglass surface until the trimaran looked less like a wrecked yacht and more like a drifting reef. And as the growth spread, fish followed. At first they appeared occasionally, then in growing numbers. Kingfish began circling the hull regularly, and the men quickly turned that into an opportunity. Using improvised gear, they learned to spear fish from the slick, unstable surface of the upturned hull. It was precarious and physically demanding work, but it changed their situation fundamentally. Fresh food, regular meals, a use for the gas cooker and barbecue John had salvaged weeks earlier. By the second and third months, fishing had become a daily activity and a source of both nutrition and purpose. They caught enough that they could joke, only half sarcastically, that they were eating better than people back home. This was a long way from the 2 tablespoons of uncooked rice they had rationed per person per day in the earliest weeks. John, for his part, relied heavily on mental discipline to keep himself functional during the lowest points, when storms trapped them below for days and there was nothing to do but wait. He practiced a kind of deliberate mental escape, imagining himself somewhere warm, dry, and home. It gave him a way to endure the time without letting it break him. He also kept a logbook throughout the ordeal. In the early days, his entries were detailed and thorough. By day 116, he was down to a few lines, ending with a question that was equal parts exhausted humor and genuine plea. Was this enough? Could he go home now? He had no idea how close to an answer he was. For most of the 4 months the men spent adrift, they had no meaningful way to track where they were going. There were no working navigational instruments, no charts to cross-reference. The horizon offered nothing but open water in every direction. They had no way to know their position, their heading, or how far they had traveled. Based on where the capsize had occurred and what was known about ocean conditions in that part of the world, the logical outcome was clear to anyone who understood the region. The area they were drifting through sat within what sailors call the Roaring Forties, a band of latitudes in the southern hemisphere where powerful westerly winds blow almost constantly, pushing anything in their path steadily eastward. A disabled vessel caught in those winds and currents would normally be carried thousands of miles to the east. If the Rose Noelle had followed that expected pattern, the men would most likely have ended up somewhere off the coast of South America, assuming they survived the journey at all. Instead, something different happened. The winds that were supposed to drive them east didn't behave as expected. Gradually, unimperceptibly, they shifted, and rather than being carried further out into the Pacific, the overturned trimaran began drifting back in the direction it had come from. Day after day, without any of the men realizing it, the Rose Noelle was moving westward, back toward New Zealand. On day 118, land appeared on the horizon. It was September 30th, 1989, when the Rose Noelle finally reached shore. The approach was violent, 9-foot waves, or roughly 3 meters, driving what remained of the yacht hard toward the coast of Great Barrier Island, about 56 miles northeast of Auckland. As the trimaran was thrown against the shoreline, the fiberglass hull, already weakened by months of marine growth, saltwater, and physical stress, broke apart. The men scrambled through the wreckage and pulled themselves onto land. All 4 made it. And the location where they came ashore turned out to matter more than it might have seemed. They landed at a place called Little Waterfall Bay, a sheltered section of the island's southeastern coastline. Just a short distance in either direction, the shore gave way to sheer rocky cliffs. Had the Rose Noelle struck there instead, the men would almost certainly have been killed before reaching land. They spent their first night in the bush, unsure of where they were or how far from help, but after 118 days of constant motion at sea, solid ground, even cold, unfamiliar bush, felt like a relief they hadn't known they were capable of anymore. The next day, the men set out from the shoreline looking for signs of people. They came across an unoccupied house. With no other options and no one around to ask, they went inside. And over the next several hours, they did things they hadn't been able to do in 4 months. Washed, shaved, changed into clean clothes they found inside, cooked a proper meal, and then slept in separate beds through the night. The following morning, they located a neighboring property with a working phone and contacted the island's sole police officer to report that they were alive. The response was immediate and widespread. Word moved quickly that 4 men who had been presumed lost at sea had walked out of the New Zealand bush, and the media moved just as fast to cover the story. But the story didn't end there, and the aftermath wasn't entirely what the men had expected. Almost immediately after their return, questions began emerging that didn't have easy answers. The most significant was the drift itself. Based on the crew's account of where the capsize had occurred, roughly 140 miles off the east coast of New Zealand, the prevailing winds and currents should have carried the Rose Noelle steadily eastward, deeper into the Pacific. Instead, the boat had come ashore on the opposite side of the North Island. Authorities and maritime experts couldn't reconcile the two. There was also the matter of radio transmissions. Maritime records showed messages believed to have originated from the Rose Noelle in the days after the crew said the capsize had occurred. One of those messages placed the yacht near the Kermadec Islands, more than 500 miles northeast of Auckland, well away from where the men said they had been when the wave struck. If those transmissions genuinely came from the Rose Noelle, and then either the timeline the men had given was incorrect or the capsize hadn't happened when or where they claimed. Investigators acknowledged the possibility that another vessel had sent the messages, but they couldn't confirm it either way. Other questions followed. Some experienced sailors raised doubts about whether 4 people could spend that long drifting at sea in a southern winter without developing the kinds of pressure injuries and skin conditions typically associated with long-term immobility and constant moisture exposure. Others pointed out that a vessel drifting for 4 months might reasonably be expected to pass within visible range of at least some maritime traffic. The scrutiny intensified. Speculation spread. Some commentators suggested the entire account was fabricated. Others proposed that the men may have been involved in something illegal and constructed the survival story to explain their whereabouts. For 4 men who had just spent nearly 4 months surviving one of the most extreme ordeals imaginable, being asked to defend the truth of their own experience was a jarring and deeply unwelcome development. The investigation, however, was thorough. When authorities examined what remained of the Rose Noelle, they found extensive marine growth covering the hull, the kind that accumulates only over a prolonged period of submersion. That evidence alone strongly supported the claim that the boat had been drifting upside down at sea for months. As for the drift pattern, John maintained that the currents in that part of the ocean were less predictable and less consistent than many sailors assumed, and that a light, overturned trimaran could be moved in unexpected directions by persistent wind shifts over time. In the end, no evidence of deception was found. The official conclusion supported the men's account. The aftermath of the Rose Noelle ordeal was different for each of the men who lived through it. Physically, they were in better condition than many people anticipated. Some had lost as much as 40 pounds during the 4 months, but none had suffered the catastrophic injuries that might have been expected. John would later say that what affected him most wasn't hunger or cold, but the absence of movement, the physical toll of spending months in a space too small to properly exercise in. Mentally, the experience landed differently depending on the person. John had never fully doubted that they would get through it. Survival had felt inevitable to him, even during the worst of it. Phil had held on by thinking of his family, his wife, his 4 children, everything he had to go back to. Karen, waiting in New Zealand, had refused to accept that he was gone, even when others encouraged her to consider the possibility. As for Rick and Jim, despite everything the 4 men had endured together, the bonds formed in that cramped, overturned cabin did not survive the return to land. Rick and Jim said they had no desire to see John again. John said the same about them. Whatever had been built between them during those 118 days stayed there. In total, the Rose Noelle drifted nearly 1,900 miles, or around 3,000 kilometers before coming ashore. The crew survived 118 days upside down at sea. It remains one of the longest documented maritime survival ordeals on record. If you made it to the end of this one, thank you for watching Creepy Real Stories. Drop a comment below. Would you have made it? And don't forget to like and subscribe for more real stories like this one. I'll see you in the next one.